So, Sea of Stars. This was a game that was really hyped up to me. On the RPG Holiday Special last year, someone was sad I didn't mention it, and a friend of mine is also very into it, so I had to give it a try. Unfortunately, the hype may have backfired a bit, as I merely thought this was a pretty good game. Looking back, I should have known better, because my tastes tend to always be a bit contrary. Because honestly, this game is just, I don't know, not really my style, but I still want to talk about it because, well, just because it didn't resonate much with me doesn't mean I don't think it deserves to be promoted here. I don't like when criticism gets too prescriptive, and while it didn't really resonate with me, I did end up getting an understanding of what I think the game is trying to be. So I'm going to try and be as fair as possible in hopes that if you do end up being someone who might like this game, I might still convince you to try it, but don't expect things to be nothing but glowing praise. But look, I've definitely given harsher descriptions to games I've enjoyed more. Just look at my Etrian Odyssey Nexus section in my Games of 2019 video. Anyway, enough of me pathetically trying to cover my ass. Let's just get into it, shall we? To be honest, I feel like the game's narrative and world are more vibe-based than anything. You have to be on board with its visual style and self-aware personality to really click with this. And unfortunately, yeah, this just ain't my style, and is probably where like half my issues with the game lie. I just tend to like my fantasy a bit more muted and a bit more self-serious. This has the vibe of what you might expect from a stereotypical modern Dungeons & Dragons campaign. I try and use this comparison about as neutrally as I can, but whether or not that sounds like a good thing to you is probably a good indicator of how you'll feel about this game's general spirit. The game's clearly trying to be fun and lighthearted, but often doesn't really go that far beyond it. Most you get is some occasional darker visuals. I never really felt particularly invested in the plot or most of the characters, save for one or two. But really the biggest issue I had with it is probably the pacing. It feels like there are a lot of areas that are just kind of filler. And look, I do actually think some amount of quote-unquote filler is necessary in games trying to be a grand journey like most RPGs are. But the issue here is there's just not enough that happens during these filler sections. Most RPGs would use these for character moments and the like. But most of the characters here are pretty static, and the dungeons rarely have unique enough mechanics to keep things fresh as you explore them, and even when the plot does move forward, it's not terribly engaging to me. All this especially is a problem in the early game, which I find to be particularly slow. But there is some stuff here that I really like. The backstory with the alchemist and the fleshmancer, genuinely interesting. Probably more so than most of the current going-ons. And the protagonist's childhood friend Carl is genuinely the most compelling party member, just by virtue of being a guy with a pleasant personality, a good heart that means he always wants to help others, an unshakable determination, and frankly it feels like he just gets a lot more lines than the other characters and more agency. He actually feels more like the hero of this story than his two friends with the special powers. Plus, most of the main character designs are really great. Combat, meanwhile, is pretty solid. It's all very emblematic of the game as a whole. It's fairly standard turn-based combat with some spices added. Its biggest sin is probably that it tries a few too many things, and they don't quite all fit together at first, only really coming together later. There's some basic action commands on attacks and defense that keep you engaged with the game, although a lot of them aren't exactly explained. Glaringly, every character's basic attack will turn from a single hit into a two-hit combo if you press the button on the hit, except one. One character throws a bomb, and there's no timing requirement to make the second bomb happen, but if you time it so that both bombs hit at the same time, it deals splash damage. The game does not communicate this. Where it gets a little more creative is the initiative system. Each round of combat, you pick a character to take their turn, and then the enemy's action timers count down with them acting when they hit 0, and then you repeat until you have taken an action with all of your party members. It gives you a nice bit of control to plan out how you'll deal with enemy attacks or which enemies to focus on. I do love when a game gives me both reasons and means to prioritize targets in combat. It's a good feeling when you're able to prioritize and take down an enemy before they get to act. The game's also pretty good at encouraging a mix of normal and skill attacks, which again, I like. If a game can make me use my normal attacks strategically, that's automatically a pretty big win for an RPG. See also Bug Fables for another game that does that exceptionally well. Here there's mainly two things encouraging you to use your normal attacks. First is that while you do have limited MP, you regain a decent chunk of it every time you use a normal attack. On top of that, there's the live magic system where performing normal attacks builds up charges shared among your party members up to 3, and which your characters can use to imbue their attack with magic to boost their damage, and if they have an innate element, add that to their attacks. Mostly this is used for hitting weaknesses for extra damage or breaking locks, which I'll explain in a second. So the game should already have a good balance with normal attacks having good utility, while skills should presumably be able to stand on their own. Unfortunately, one system doesn't quite click with this. When enemies use certain attacks, they can be interrupted by hitting them with the right elements, including the physical elements. This is kind of cool. I do enjoy when an RPG encourages more than just spam, but because of how MP works and how important special attacks are to dealing with these locks effectively, it does feel like it discourages just throwing out special moves for a bit of extra damage. Your MP is just a little too limited at the start, generally only enough for a character to use a single special move before they are completely empty. So you can kind of end up screwing yourself by forcing yourself to read a nasty attack because you used a special move when you shouldn't have. And so the result is you're kind of encouraged to only use these special moves when they're required to break a lock. It's honestly kind of a recurring problem with the game demanding combos you cannot perform. Sometimes it's specific combinations like requiring 2 hits of an element at a point where you can only deal 1 hit of that element in a turn, or requiring 2 characters worth of actions when you're only given a 1-turn window to perform them. And this is on top of the possibility you might not have the MP or live magic charges, leading to a feeling of randomness that can often be annoying. Sometimes the game just outright requires you to use a damage type that you don't have yet, usually to tease an upcoming character, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating. And when these special moves are something really annoying like a heal, it can get tedious. Though thankfully as you do level up and get stronger, enemy special attacks aren't quite as devastating. The game also has combo attacks that serve as super moves and provide a bit of extra incentive to use various skills. You can build up to 3 combo points and then spend whatever the cost is to use a move. Although for a lot of the game I found the 2-point healing combo overshadowed most of the others, just because for a good while your resources are so limited that yes, a heal that doesn't cost one of your character's MP is huge. And then after that it mostly became about using them for raw damage, but I don't know, maybe this has to do with me playing with a hard mode option enabled. Actually, that could also be behind the issues with locks, which definitely were a thing, but then again, most of the game still felt pretty fair. I got stuck a few times, but not really any more than I would expect from a game where I was playing on the appropriate challenge level for me. So, I don't know. Maybe if I played without that added difficulty, I would have found the game to have boring combat that can just be brute forced. That's honestly one of the big complicating factors with discussing interactive media with varied options like this. There will be different experiences, and even if I tried, it's just not possible for me to cover them all. Speaking of difficulty, that's all accomplished through the relic system, which lets you find or buy various modifiers, which is an interesting concept, but it never quite clicked with me right. Like, I never could quite decide what was or wasn't fair game or would make things too easy or too hard. So I just stuck with a basic hard mode relic, and then from there equipped one or two smaller beneficial ones. Could I have made it harder? Definitely, but it was still enough of a challenge. But adjacent to the combat is the RPG systems, which are pretty standard. There's not really any character building mechanics except for choosing a stat to boost further on level up, and I guess equipping accessories. Moves are learned through story progress, and so leveling up feels rather boring and basic, and weapons and armor are 99% just bigger numbers to equip. You could honestly trim out these mechanics and you probably wouldn't notice it that much. Which is true for a lot of RPGs, but it's a bit disappointing for a game like this that feels like it's trying to be different and maybe even a bit revolutionary and iconoclastic. Chained Echoes had the same problem with its equipment, and it stood out there too in a game that was willing to even trade away traditional leveling up to try something new. At least leveling up does mean that you will eventually have enough MP to actually use special moves a little more without worrying about being screwed out of lock breaking. It takes a while, which contributes to the game's slow start, but once you do have enough, the game feels sufficiently tactical. So I need to stress that the gameplay is good. Better than, like, default baseline RPG maker-ass turn-based combat. But it does take a little while to get there, and in the early game some of the different ideas end up competing and getting in each other's ways. But it does eventually come together into something that does work. But then unfortunately there's not a ton of mechanical progression after a certain point, so the late game then starts to feel a little repetitive. All that said though, I think it does work well for the style of game this is trying to be. So let's get to the conclusion and talk about the kind of game I think this is. So, should you play Sea of Stars? Is it one of the best RPGs ever made? My answer is a resounding, maybe. It's awkward for me to recommend. I can definitely see where it's well made, but it doesn't really speak to my style, and also it's just not really what I look for in an RPG. I like games with rich customization, engaging mechanics, and unique ideas that break the mold a bit. Stuff like Chained Echoes or Grandia. Games that admittedly also are more to my taste in the story department too. But I'm not so absorbed in my own tastes, I cannot recognize what Sea of Stars is trying to be. It's a laid-back sort of RPG, which is a tradition that dates back to the early days of video game RPGs, a result of early streamlining of the genre and supported by the fact that early RPGs were often able to be carried by their stories, which they were some of the only games that you could find a story in at the time. When many older RPGs often equated to mashing your numbers against the enemy's numbers, yeah, it's kind of just a chill experience. Often carried on these days by stuff like certain MMOs or certain mobile games. And viewed through this lens, yeah, it's pretty great at being that, frankly. It's a great comfort food RPG if you are in the mood for that. Maybe one of the best, even. Combat's not going to demand any crazy strategy or optimized build, but there's enough complexity that you can't just zone out and mash attack or spam skills, unless you want to and choose to make the game easier. The story isn't deep or challenging, but it's fun enough and has its high points. Again, probably even more so if you're not so serious and grumpy like me. The game doesn't demand too much of you, but offers plenty of side stuff to engage with if you want to. I still do think the pacing is a bit of an issue, considering both the slow start, plenty of filler, and also the fact that it drags a little towards the end. I do feel like I personally would have enjoyed it more if it were shorter and a bit more briskly paced. But if you're just vibing with the game, maybe even that isn't so bad. As I said, it's meant to be laid back, so maybe that's a perk to you. And heck, I did probably spend more time than I needed to exploring and doing side content, so maybe some of the pacing issues are my fault after a certain point. So if you want something more mechanically complex in your RPGs, this is for you. Check out my holiday special I did last year if you want some games that might be more your speed. But even if it isn't the type I love most, even if it didn't quite live up to the hype for me, once I got over the hurdle of the slow start, I found myself often spending all day playing this game. Even when I had the time to play something else, I just kept going, not just because I wanted to get it done for this video. I think that says enough, right? But what do you think? Is this one of your favorite RPGs? Is this laid-back experience what you look for in the genre? Or do you prefer the more mechanically intensive RPGs like I do? Let me know in the comments. For now, this is Mikhail, signing off.